Welcome to UNB's Light Lens show. I am Nahar Khan, and today our guest is Dr. Danilo Turk, the former president of Slovenia, a human rights expert, a professor in international law, and a political figure. Dr. Turk also served as the UN Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs from 2000 to 2005. Dr. Turk, welcome to our UNB Light and Lens show.
Thank you.
And welcome to Bangladesh. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for being with us here today. So your maiden visit to Bangladesh was in association with the Cosmos Foundation under its dialogue series on EU and the contemporary global scenario, which happened to take place in the city yesterday. How has your experience been?
Well, the experience has been very positive, but not surprising, because I have known many people, diplomats, intellectuals, public figures from Bangladesh with whom I used to meet in other places, especially in New York, where I worked for a number of years, but also in other United Nations centers, such as Geneva or Vienna, where Bangladesh has always been very strongly present, not necessarily with large number of people, but with great quality of diplomats. And it has always been interesting to listen to what my counterparts would say. Now, that's the background with which I came to Dhaka, and I was not disappointed, because yesterday we had a very lively discussion with a number of people who are very well informed, who think really deeply about the changes of the world. And that's also not surprising, because Bangladesh has had such a dynamic development in the past 20, 30 years, that the country has been changed, and it's a different player nowadays. So I expected to have a lively discussion, a lot of interest for the developments in the European Union and the whole dynamic of the world, where European Union is a major player. But so is also Bangladesh. Bangladesh has a very strong reason to be active in various fields, so the discussion reflected all that. The traditional quality of Bangladesh diplomacy and public service, intellectual circles, but also this new dynamic of following and participating in global change, global transformation. So that is what created my impressions.
Wonderful, thank you. So currently the world is focused on the US-Iran tensions in the Middle East. How do you see this crisis developing, and what role do you think the EU can perhaps play in any possible de-escalation?
Well, first, the killing of General Soleimani and the Iranian reaction in a way demonstrated the depth of the whole tragedy. Now, the fact that in this environment of kind of a war, a civilian airplane was shot down, and there were many casualties, completely innocent people. That, I think, should work as a shock to Iran, but also as a shock to others who are involved in this situation. And I think that this feeling of shock should really lead people to think about peace, about peaceful future. It is good that everybody is talking about de-escalation now, but de-escalation is not enough. What I would like to emphasize, de-escalation is not enough. What one needs to think about is preservation of the global system of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. If things don't work with regard to Iran, they may actually lead to further aggravation and further proliferation of nuclear weapons. And then I think also the sanctions that are being imposed on Iran are counterproductive. So one should think about gradual reduction and lifting of sanctions as a part of a process leading towards a peaceful and a permanent settlement. Now, this, of course, are very big tasks. And the question is, what can European Union do in this context? I think the first thing the European Union should do is to explain to the world that it's not going to be passive. It is very good that Mr. Borrell, who is the chief representative of the European Union for foreign and security matters, has invited Mr. Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran. Now, such a visit, I hope, will happen, and it will be well prepared. I hope it will be well prepared. And in that context, obviously, one would need to figure out what the immediate steps are. European Union should not follow blindly the action of the United States. European Union should figure out its own role. European Union should help easing tensions and reducing sanctions. That's an important ingredient in bringing a degree of stability and eventually preserving the non-proliferation system.
Thank you. It is being said that the post-Second World War order is giving way to a new norm of global disorder. Some key global institutions, such as the United Nations, is currently under pressure, and you yourself have a long experience of this international organization. So how do you think that the UN what can they do to remain relevant in global politics?
Well, this is a very good and very deep question, because keeping relevance is not an easy matter for the United Nations. Now, I have to explain, United Nations is there. It's not going to be irrelevant. It's going to be relevant to some extent. And the real question is how relevant we want UN to be. Obviously, different states have different approaches to this question. And there are very powerful non-state actors, private companies, civil society organizations, which may not think much about the United Nations, and that's part of the problem. Now, I believe that there are two major directions in which United Nations should evolve. One is the progress in implementing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is a broad development agenda which was adopted by the United Nations in 2015. It is being implemented. We'll see how good that implementation process is. And there are some key players that have to be very strongly involved in this process. Just two examples. European Union is one, clearly, and the other is China. I hope that these two players, two major global players, will help in the process of implementation of Sustainable Development Goals. That's one area. The other major priority would be the work of the Secretary General of the United Nations. We have seen that the collective bodies of the United Nations are somewhat paralyzed, in fact, or not sufficiently agile as a result of disagreements among major powers. Now, this is a situation where the Secretary General has to be as active as possible. From my previous experience, I know that this is not an easy matter, because Secretary General has to be very careful not to be unsuccessful. He has to succeed, but he cannot limit his activity only to projects where he would succeed. Sometimes it is important to make a point. Sometimes it is important to make a warning. Sometimes it is important for the Secretary General to travel to places where there are serious problems, even if he cannot provide solutions immediately. So I would say activation of the remaining capacity of the Secretary General is the other priority, in addition to the activity of the organization as a whole to uphold and implement Sustainable Development Goals.
Right. Moving closer to your home, it now appears that the UK is poised to leave the EU on the 31st of January of this year. Broadly speaking, what kind of impact do you think Brexit will have on the European Union?
Well, I think that the impact will be a further complication, because the negotiations between Britain and the United Kingdom on the one hand and the European Union is going to have to deal with rather complex matters. How to arrange the economic cooperation in a system where we would like to retain supply chains that exist and which are complex. We don't want to go back to the kind of basic trade in goods. I mean, that of course is part of the picture, but only a smaller part. The bigger part is the supply chains and also provision of services. And negotiations will have to figure out how to do it and what kind of rules and regulations are needed to make sure that this doesn't create too much of a problem especially for the British side, which is smaller compared to the European Union as a whole. So this is going to be a complicated process of negotiations, and that's one problem. Then when it comes to the political side of this, I think the European Union has already accepted the idea of Britain leaving. And of course, United Kingdom has its own long history. There are good reasons that have motivated people to decide to leave, reasons which European Union understands. On the other hand, the continent has grown more cohesive. Nobody wants to emulate the United Kingdom in the sense of leaving. Quite to the contrary. Everybody understands that sticking together, working together in the European Union is by far a preferable option. So on the political side, we have seen more commitment, more devotion to the European Union among the countries that will remain in the European Union. And I believe that that's the reality in which we have to figure out the future role of the European Union. And I believe that that's doable, and the European Union will continue to flourish.
Thank you, Excellency. We currently live in a world where the power and influence of China is, rapidly rising both economically and strategically. Do you feel that this is good or bad for the world? And what are your general views on China's Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, I think that this is both good and natural. China is an old civilization. China is more than a nation state. It's an entire civilization. It's a very populous country. It's a country which continues to have huge development needs. It's not a saturated economy, which would, trying to preserve its balance. It's a very fast-growing country and civilization. Therefore, I think that it is expected that the needs of development will sooner or later start affecting the world as a whole. And that's what's happening. I think that this is a good development. And I think that it is good for China to develop further, and it will be good for the world that China develops further. There will have to be new priorities in this context. One of them is combating global warming, figuring out how to structure the economic development to make sure that global warming does not produce a global disaster. We are now fast approaching the point of disaster, and there are important players in the world, such as European Union, who want to prevent that from happening. And I believe that European Union and China are natural partners in that effort. So my hope would be that European Union and China will work together for prevention of global disaster resulting from global warming. Now, of course, others should also join, but right now we have difficulties in the United States with the current policies not going in that direction. But there are many other tendencies within the United States which will eventually prevail, I believe. So what we need is really to kind of direct this whole process towards the type of development which would prevent a global disaster resulting from global warming to happen. Belt and Road Initiative is again another example of China's influence in the world. It's an expected extrapolation of China's own development. And I believe that others have to figure out what is the advantage for partnering with China and Chinese companies, actors that constitute the Belt and Road process. So my expectation there is that this will also be a good thing for development of the world, and I welcome it.
Thank you. Excellency, yesterday you spoke about, at the session, you spoke about the Green Deal.
Yes.
Could you elaborate a little on that?
Well, that's the European priority now, with the new set of institutions, in particular the European Commission, which has started to work in December. The Green New Deal was, or the European Green Deal is a centerpiece of policy making by the European Commission. It includes the very ambitious vision of making Europe carbon neutral by 2050. It involves a variety of measures, including legislative measures, which will impose taxation on use of carbon or carbon emissions. It includes the idea of a green pact in Europe, which would involve not only governments, but also businesses, schools, civil society organizations, in order to ensure that this whole process of change is carried by all the relevant actors who have to participate in this context. And then a third element there is a cyclical economy, reducing the waste or organizing the whole production in a circular manner so that the amount of waste is reduced to the minimum. Now, these are the three examples. Obviously, all that will require a great deal of investment. We are talking about 1 trillion of euros within a decade, between 2020 and 2030. If all these things are put together, you see that this is a major transformative project, which will hopefully change Europe for the better in the coming decade, and help also partners of Europe to participate and take part in this process of change.
Absolutely. I think it's a very commendable initiative, and I think EU will be setting a very strong example on a global scale.
We understand that obviously we have common, but again, differentiated responsibility. Now, Europe is defined as the old continent. And it is old in many ways. I mean, population is older, but also the industries are older there. And we are now beyond the industrial phase, in the post-industrial phase of development. Now, there are other parts of the world, which include China, where industrial phase is still very much the priority today. So we have to figure out how does one expedite this industrial phase into low carbon industry or beyond carbon type of industry, which is necessary to make sure that the global disaster of climate change is prevented. Not everybody can have a plan as ambitious as European Union, but European Union has to figure out how to work with everybody else to produce a good global result. Climate is global. Climate is not European.
Absolutely. It's a global issue.
Yes.
Thank you. Moving closer to home in South Asia, there's a strong feeling in some quarters that pluralism in today's India is on decline. This can lead to the escalation of regional tension in our part of the world. And do you have any thoughts on this issue?
Well, we have become used to view India as an actor of stability over many decades. And therefore, when some of these new developments are seen, this clearly gives rise to concern, especially with the effects on the autonomy in Kashmir, which obviously is a sensitive area, one which creates a great deal of international concern. Then more recently, the question of the amendment to the citizenship law, again creates a sense of tensions which we were not used to see in India. India was seen as a country which uses democratic institutions to strengthen tolerance and cooperation among different religions, different ethnic communities, and so forth. And of course, the outside world is watching this with concern. Now, that concern is not expressed politically, and hopefully will not have to be. But of course, the non-governmental organizations, the human rights activists, are, following this development with great concern, and that's reflected in the media. So the public opinion in the world is becoming sensitized to this development. I cannot go as far as to say that this is a very definitive process in India. India is a democracy, so there will be elections. We'll see how all that affects future politics in India. But right now, the phenomena that we see are giving rise to concern, and I believe that political wisdom in India should advise the leaders to think again about such things as reduction or abolition of autonomy for Kashmir, changes in the citizenship law that are problematic, and then also phenomena like violence at the university in New Delhi, again, are disturbing, and all that has to be taken quite seriously.
Absolutely. Thank you. Excellency, 2019 saw the rise of the technology war between Beijing and Washington, and it seems that in 2020, this restriction on flow of technology will continue. So in your opinion, how does this tech war impact the health of the global system, particularly the European Union, and also emerging economy like Bangladesh?
Well, again, this is an unfortunate turn of developments, because one did hope until very recently that the technological development will be based on the idea of cooperation, because the new technologies require cooperation in research, in production of different components, and in supply chains, which ideally should be global. Now, the trade war, which started with tariffs in trade in goods, and which was started by United States, led to further complications in the sphere of technology, which are much more harmful than the trade war in trading goods. So we are really at a very important moment right now. Now, my hope would be that this technological competition will not go too far, because it would slow down the whole technological development. I believe that both China and United States should be interested in cooperating. China has made certain advances, for example, in the 5G technology, where they are the leading force. But again, that's not the only thing in the technology sector. And cooperation would be far preferable to the kind of warlike competition which is now emerging. So my appeal would be that, well, let's calm down the situation a little bit and see if cooperation for the future is possible. I see this also reflected in some of the statements by the leaders in China, offering kind of technological centers in parts of China for future cooperation. This doesn't appear to be a viable alternative to the competition and war in technology that we see now emerging, but it is an important idea, and I hope that idea will have some traction in the West as well.
Thank you. Moving much closer to home now, what do you think should be the role of middling powers like Bangladesh on the global scenario?
Well, this is not an easy question today, because the world is so much influenced by the competition among the major powers. So there appears to be very little scope, very little space for mid-level powers or mid-level countries to play a significant role. Now, one way of addressing this problem would be to develop a new agenda, which could bring together a large number of countries, an agenda for multilateral cooperation. I mentioned before that cooperation for the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals is a vital priority for the world and for the United Nations. And of course, much of that depends on multilateral cooperation, not on bilateral relations, not on great power cooperation or competition, but on truly multilateral cooperation. So I think countries like Bangladesh and groups of countries such as European Union have every reason to put together a very strong and very precise agenda of priorities for the future, and then try to mobilize a larger number of countries around that agenda, which I would call agenda for multilateralism. Now, I know that terminology of multilateralism is not always easy to pronounce, let alone explain. But the fact is that some of the priorities today, for example, those related to global warming, can be addressed only on the broadest platform, involving the broadest number of countries. And here is an area where Bangladesh can play a very significant role. Bangladesh is a country which has been affected by global warming already, which is very vulnerable to climate change and natural disasters, violent changes of weather patterns. So the motivation of Bangladesh in this area is understood, it is legitimate, and it can be a powerful element in building this global agenda that I'm talking about. So while I see the difficulty now at the time of great power competition, I also see an opportunity and a need for other countries which are not involved in the great power competition, but which suffer from that competition, to come with their own agenda, with their own priorities, make sure that these priorities are given attention to in the United Nations, in groupings like G20 and G7 and in other places, and also, of course, in the regional organizations. That, I think, is the way forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Excellency, for a very stimulating discussion today. I think that our viewers have learned a lot about the EU and the global scenario in general, as have I. And we welcome you back to Bangladesh again in the very near future.
It would be my pleasure to come again.
Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
This is Nahar Khan from UNB Light Lens. Thank you for tuning in today, and we look forward to seeing you again.